Welcome everyone. In this video, let me take you with me on a journey in my field of expertise, but also my passion, my obsession. And this is called the science and art of causality. Let's see why I also like to call this an art form. So, first things first. Why causality? Why I'm so obsessed with this topic? Well, because every decision we make at the individual level or firms level or politicians for countries are usually based on causal chains. So, for example, if you decide to go vegan, it might be because you think that there are some health benefit, or most likely because you think that it will reduce your footprints. So you think that there is a clear consequences, but you assume this, and it's definitely not simple and trivial to assess. You might think that if you drink one more shot of vodka, you'll dance better. At the firm level, firms could think about the many questions. If we change our advertisements methodology, will it impact the sales, the subscriptions? If we prevent people working from home, do we increase productivity, or is it the reverse? At the government level, at countries level, constantly politicians have to answer those kind of questions. It's very often difficult. For example, if we leave nuclear energy, will it help to reach the Paris Agreement, or will it make it impossible? And we have many questions that we are trying constantly to answer. The thing is, if we fail to assess properly the relationship, the causal chain, it might be very costly. First, a firm, people, governments might put a lot of effort, of resources to observe, get data, and then put more resources to analyze those data. And then, if the conclusion is wrong, might lose even more resources by following a wrong pathway. So, that's why it's so important to assess causality. It also helps when we read the news, when we listen to politicians, when we discuss with others, to reduce the risk of being manipulated, of suffering from misinformation. And those tools, and that's what will be so fantastic, that you can learn them. You can really learn practical methods that you can apply daily to fight misinformation and to make better or more educated decisions. So, actually, why is it so hard to assess causality? Because maybe it could be just simple, using math, we could get a clean answer. But that's the trick. That's why it's a science, but also almost an art form. Because you don't have actually a statistical test that will tell you and prove that your result is causal. You can do many things in that direction, many things to test what we call the identifying assumptions, to identify the causal effects. But usually we cannot test directly those assumptions. We can just do things around and go closer and closer to this. And this is why actually it's so exciting, because it means that you also need to understand causality, to rely on your knowledge. Use your brain, think about the relationships. And this is what's particularly exciting about this topic and field of expertise. So, really go to the bottom line of this with the main problem with causal inference. But first, let's illustrate this main problem. So, if we often we look at statistics, and it's not the statistics that are wrong, it's the interpretation of the data. And here I have two graphs. On the left, you have the global direct primary energy consumption in the world, and it's split between the renewable energies and other source of energy production. Then on the other graph, you have the CO2 emission of the world, also from 1900s to 2020. Both are growing. It's very hard here to see that it's slowing down or going down, even if renewable energies are more and more used. And that's why some people argue, well, renewable energies are not necessarily useful. As we can see here, it just piles up on other energy resources. So actually, it's not even changing or impacting our environment. It's just piling up on other energies. Well, the thing is, here, why it's impossible to answer with such an analysis or to use such simple statistics to claim that there is an effect or relationship. The thing is, we don't know what will happen without renewable energies. We don't have the world without renewable energies. So maybe it will go faster for different reasons, because we will not be able to substitute fossil fuel by renewable energies, which tend to produce less GHG, so greenhouse gas emission, the renewable energies sources. But also maybe it will grow lower because, I don't know, extracting resources for photovoltaic cells is really expensive and generate a lot of emission as well. So we could think about different mechanisms. Here, with aggregated data, bottom line, it's impossible to answer. What we need, ideally, to perfectly answer this question, being able to perfectly measure and quantify the effect, will be to have two parallel worlds. And in one of the two worlds, you have the renewable energy, and in the other, you don't. And it's the only thing that's different. And as it's the only thing that changes between the two worlds, if there is a difference with the emissions, then it might be, or most certainly, it will be caused by this difference, which is the only difference. But of course, we don't have parallel worlds. And this is what we call the fundamental problem of causal inference. We never perfectly observe this. We never have a subject who is sick and take the pill, a medication, and do not take the pill at the same time. So we never have the perfect, what we call the counterfactual, the alternative world without the treatment, without the pill, or without renewable energy. And hence, what we are trying to do is to replicate, or at least go as close as possible to this ideal situation. So usually the first answer, and often called the gold standard, arguably the best solution to do this, is to do what we call a randomized control trial, or now in firms it's rather called A/B testing. We will take a sample, hopefully representative of a bigger population, and then we randomly allocate between two groups or more groups a pill and a placebo. We apply a treatment and we do a control. And then, as the people in the experiment, or what we observe, usually don't know if they receive the pill or the placebo, because that's what we call blinding. They don't even know. They have nothing to say about it. So it allows to get rid of many potential biases. The two groups are arguably comparable. The only thing changing is the pill or the placebo, the treatment or the control. And hence, if we find an effect, it might be causal. The thing is, nothing is perfect. And as I told you, it's impossible to directly prove causality. We can rather pile up evidences until we are convinced that it's causal. So an RCT, or randomized control trial, will work very well if it's perfectly made, but there are two main weaknesses. The first is that we cannot always use randomized control trial, because sometimes it's impossible, like manipulating a gender just for the sake of an experiment, or it might be unethical. So gender could actually go in both categories, but let's say I have a paper assessing the effect of weapons exports on the probability of conflict in Africa. We are not going to randomly send weapons in different countries to see if there is an effect between the two. And there is another weakness with randomized control trial, is usually when we control perfectly the environment for an experiment. For example, we take labs, rats in a lab. They are very comparable, almost identical. Well, the thing is, we lose external validity. It might be very internally valid, so we manage within the context of the study to observe the causal effect, but it comes at a cost of external validity. Can we extrapolate, for example, with rats to other strains of rats, to humans? It might be harder. And there is this fantastic paper, a real paper, illustrating this. Or rather, the aim was to highlight and make people cautious about those risks. So there's this paper published in a very famous and well-known medical journal, the British Medical Journal, BMJ. And the title was the following: Parachute used to prevent death and major trauma. Does it say used to? The thing is, in this experiment, so it's a randomized control trial, they managed to enroll 22 volunteers over a period of 1 year between 2017 and 2018, and they made them jump from a plane, so they were a volunteer, either with a parachute or with an empty backpack. The outcome, what they measured, was the probability of dying or of a major trauma, physical trauma. And the result of the study is that they don't find a difference between the two groups with respect to those outcomes, death and major traumatic injury. So where's the catch? It's a real experiment. Well, the thing is, to be able to do this experiment, they of course did it on a small stationary plane, so underground. So the plane was not moving and never left, and people were just jumping more or less from 1 meter on the ground. The idea of the paper was to really highlight sometimes you try to control perfectly the environment with an experiment, and then it does not really reflect reality. So then, if it's not necessarily possible to do a randomized control trial, what can we do? Well, we can resort on what we call quasi-experimental design or natural experiment. And what's a natural experiment? Well, it's written here. It's really when we find in nature situations that will arguably randomly allocate the treatment and the control between different type of people. And as it's randomly allocated, well, it's similar to what we will do in a lab. So let me take an example. Let's say you want to assess the effect of pollution on health. You can use animals in a lab, but you're not going to use humans and expose them to lethal or very dangerous levels of chemicals and of pollutions. So here it's interesting to work with animals, it's necessary, but then if we want to really extrapolate what happens with real life, when there is a long exposure to pollution and humans doing their daily life, living their daily life, well, we can resort to a natural experiment, and that's exactly what some researchers did. So they realized that, well, sure, if we compare people from a city to rural areas, they are not comparables. Other things make them very different. What they eat, how they move, their type of work, many things make them different. And if you see that there are differences with respiratory disease between rural people and people living in cities, well, other things might explain this, potentially not pollution. But those researchers used one event to measure causally this effect. During the Olympic Games in Beijing, the government imposed very strict laws to reduce pollution over the city. So, what did they do? They closed some plants, power plants, they reduced the use of cars, and so on and so forth. So then you have exactly the same person, people living in the city, suddenly they are not anymore exposed to high level of pollution, and then they are exposed again. So you can really see for the period before, during, and after what happens with respiratory disease, and they were able to assess this effect. And the fact that there are Olympic Games and then pollution is reduced has nothing to do with their daily life, with their decision to live in Beijing. They just keep going to work, and there is a sport event, and then you can really properly assess this effect. So as we are not able to directly test for causality, there's something you can do. The main two things that questions causality is there are often other things affecting the relationship you're looking at, or sometimes the effect might go in both directions. For example, with my paper where I measure the effect of sending weapons on war, there is the other effect that's true at the same time. When there is a war, people need more weapons and import them. So it's difficult to disentangle those two effects. So this is what you can do. You can always ask if there is something else explaining these results, or if the reversed is true at the same time. Let me give you two very simple examples with this. It has been found that there is actually a high negative correlation between coffee consumption and cardiovascular disease. Okay, so coffee might be healthy. It might be the case. There are some rationale to explain this, which is an important part. Second thing is maybe there are other things explaining this, typically that are not taken into account perfectly in this paper. It might be that if you drink coffee, you're more active. Maybe you're going to work, so you're moving. Maybe you do sports, so you need also caffeine to wake up and do your training. So there are many things that might affect the fact that you drink coffee and your health in general and cardiovascular disease risk. So here it's not causal, it's just a correlation. It would require more research or different type of research to properly assess these causal effects. This is your first tool. Always ask if there is something else. Second thing, again, could it be the reverse? So when you observe that people who drink more are more depressed, is it because they drink, or are they drinking because they are depressed? Well, science or research found the two effects. So then when you see this correlation, it's very hard to disentangle the importance of one on the other, because they are kind of mixed together. Those things I really think you should always ask when you think about causal relationship, when you listen to the news, when you hear or discuss with someone about cause and effect. So, how to challenge causality? Well, we have seen the two main questions you can ask. Is there something else? Could it be the reverse? But how do we do as researchers to find causal evidence?